September 3rd, 1945. 22:14. Processing facility, Guam. Night air was thick with humidity that turned breathing into conscious effort. Each inhalation weighted with salt and decay from jungle that pressed against the facility's perimeter. Michiko Tanaka sat on concrete floor with 42 other Japanese women, knees pulled to chest, arms wrapped around shins, making herself as small as possible. The position had become habitual over the past 6 weeks, first in the caves on Saipan where they'd hidden during the final American assault, then in the makeshift holding areas after capture, now here in this converted warehouse that smelled of diesel fuel and fear. She was 29 years old. Before the war, she'd been a schoolteacher in Osaka, instructing children in mathematics and calligraphy. The imperial government had conscripted her in 1944 for civilian support services on Saipan, administrative work, food preparation, tending to wounded soldiers as American forces closed in. When the island fell on July 9, 1944, 14 months ago, she'd attempted suicide as honor required. She'd swallowed the small amount of poison she'd saved from the medical supplies, had lain down in a cave to wait for death, had woken hours later with violent nausea, but still breathing. The Americans had found her the next day, delirious from dehydration and the poison's aftermath. They'd transported her to a medical facility, treated her with intravenous fluids and medication that counteracted what remained of the poison in her system, kept her alive against her will. She'd survived when dying was the only honorable choice. Now she existed in the shameful space between death and life, waiting for what propaganda had promised would be worse than any poison. Violation followed by execution. Her body used until it ceased to be useful, then discarded like equipment that had outlived its function. Around her, 42 women sat in similar postures of protective contraction. Most were civilian support staff like herself. Some were nurses who'd tended wounded soldiers. A few were telephone operators who'd maintained communications until the very end. All of them had failed to die when dying was expected. All of them now waited for the consequences of that failure. The concrete floor was cold, despite tropical heat. The warehouse had no windows except high ventilation slits that showed stars, but provided no view of what lay beyond the walls. Electric lights hung from ceiling beams, harsh and unshaded, creating shadows that made the space feel simultaneously exposed and oppressive. The door was steel, locked from outside, with a small window at eye level that occasionally showed American guards passing in the corridor. Beside Michiko, Yuki Nakamura whispered, "Tonight. It will happen tonight." Her voice carried certainty rather than fear. Yuki was 33, from Tokyo, had worked as a nurse on Saipan. She'd seen what war did to women, had treated victims of assault during the chaotic final weeks before American forces overran the island. Her medical knowledge made her predictions about their fate more credible and more terrifying. Michiko wanted to disagree, but couldn't summon arguments. They'd been locked in this warehouse for 3 hours since 19 with no food and no explanation. The pattern was familiar from propaganda briefings. Isolate women, leave them without resources or information. Wait until dark when screams would be less noticeable, then use them however Americans chose. The propaganda had been explicit about this sequence, had warned that American forces operated under pretense of civilization, but revealed their true nature, once privacy and darkness provided cover. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Heavy boots on concrete, multiple sets, approaching with measured pace that suggested coordination rather than patrol. The sound stopped at their door. Metal scraped metal as someone worked the lock from outside. Keys rattled. The handle turned with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet warehouse. The door opened. 4 American soldiers stood in the doorway, backlit by corridor lights that turned them into silhouettes. Large men, all of them. Broad-shouldered and tall in the way American soldiers seemed universally constructed. They carried something. Large bundles or bags. Michiko couldn't tell in the harsh transition between corridor brightness and warehouse gloom. One of them reached for the light switch inside the door, flipping on additional lights that made everyone blink. Sergeant Robert Sullivan stood in the doorway, 38 years old, from Boston, with red hair going gray at the temples and an expression of exhausted patience. Behind him were Corporal James Martinez, 26, from New Mexico; Private David Chen, 24, Chinese-American from San Francisco; and Private William Thompson, 21, from Iowa. They carried large canvas bags that looked heavy based on how they held them. 2 hands per bag, weight distributed carefully. Sullivan surveyed the warehouse, noted the women's postures and expressions, and his face registered something like understanding followed by frustration. He spoke in English, voice carrying clearly. "We're bringing blankets. It's cold tonight. You'll need these." He gestured to the bags. "Blankets. For sleeping. That's all." An interpreter appeared in the doorway. Japanese-American woman in Women's Army Corps uniform, maybe 40, with features that matched the prisoners, but posture that was entirely American. She repeated Sullivan's words in Japanese, but the translation didn't penetrate the certainty that had been building since lockdown. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For 3 years, since Japan's military situation had deteriorated and propaganda had shifted from glorifying certain victory to preparing for noble defeat, Michiko had absorbed messaging about what Americans did to captured Japanese women. The propaganda had been explicit to the point of brutality. Violation was standard, systematic, universal. American forces were portrayed as racially motivated savages who viewed Japanese women as objects to be used and destroyed, who would perpetrate atrocities that made death preferable to capture. The messaging about women specifically had been detailed and graphic. Michiko had attended mandatory briefings in March 1944 as American forces approached Saipan. The officer conducting the session, Lieutenant Watanabe, whom she'd never seen again after the island fell, had been grimly specific. American forces will use captured women for their entertainment. Violation is not exception. It is policy. They will pass you among soldiers, use you until your body fails, then execute you to eliminate witnesses. The only honorable response is to die before capture. If you cannot fight, if you cannot escape, you must end your own life. This is not cowardice. This is preserving honor for yourself and your family. He distributed information about suicide methods, not cyanide capsules, which were reserved for military personnel, but practical instructions about using fabric for hanging, about locations of major arteries for cutting, about diving into ocean with stones tied to clothing. Michiko had memorized the information, unable to forget despite desperately wanting to. Preparing for moment when dying would be only acceptable choice. The propaganda had been supported by alleged testimony from survivors of earlier battles, though how there could be survivors if violation always ended in execution was logical contradiction no one questioned. Stories circulated about women captured at Atu, at Tarawa, at Kwajalein. The details varied, but the message was consistent. Capture meant prolonged sexual violence, followed by murder designed to eliminate evidence. The 14 months since Michiko's failed suicide had challenged that narrative in confusing ways. American medics had saved her life rather than allowing her to die, or actively killing her. She'd been held in medical facilities and transit camps where food was adequate and medical care was provided. She'd been transported from Saipan to Hawaii to Guam, through process that was uncomfortable, but not deliberately cruel. Guards had maintained professional distance, showing neither particular kindness nor overt hostility. But the ambiguity was destabilizing rather than reassuring. Perhaps decent treatment was temporary deception, building trust before revealing true intentions. Perhaps Americans were simply efficient, preferring healthy prisoners to sick ones for whatever use they intended. Perhaps the propaganda had been right, but the timing was being drawn out through administrative delays and resource constraints. Now, watching 4 American soldiers enter the warehouse at night carrying heavy bags, Michiko's framework for understanding their intentions snapped into the certainty propaganda had created. This was the moment. Night, isolation, locked door, 4 men, bags that could contain anything. The sequence matched propaganda predictions perfectly. Whatever the bags contained, it wasn't blankets. Blankets would be distributed during day, not at night, when darkness concealed activities that couldn't bear witness. Sullivan seemed to recognize that his words weren't penetrating. He spoke to Chen in rapid English, conversation Michiko couldn't follow. Then Chen stepped forward. His Japanese was better than most American soldiers, accent less pronounced. suggesting heritage or extensive study. "My name is Private Chen. I understand you are frightened. I understand why. But Sergeant Sullivan is telling truth. We have blankets. Just blankets. The warehouse is cold at night. Concrete floor, no insulation. Temperature drops significantly after sunset. Colonel Patterson ordered blankets distributed to all housing facilities. That is all this is. Blanket distribution." Yuki spoke before Michiko could formulate response. "Why now? Why at night? Why 4 soldiers for blanket distribution?" Chen translated for Sullivan, who responded through Chen. "Now because blankets just arrived from supply. They've been requested for 3 weeks, but logistics are complicated. Night, because that's when they arrived. 4 of us because the bags are heavy. 43 blankets per bag, wool blankets, maybe 60 pounds each. We need multiple people to carry them." The explanation was reasonable, logical even. But logic required overriding weeks of mounting certainty, required believing that bags contained exactly what soldiers claimed, rather than what propaganda had promised. Sullivan opened one of the canvas bags and withdrew its contents. A folded gray wool blanket, standard U.S. Army issue, thick and heavy. He held it up, shook it open so they could see the full blanket, approximately 6 feet by 7 feet, properly woven, with weight that suggested actual insulation. Then he did something unexpected. He wrapped it around his own shoulders, demonstrating. "See? Just blanket, warm. For sleeping. Not trap, not trick. Just practical supply distribution." The demonstration was more effective than words because it was so mundane. If the blankets were weapons or contaminated or cover for something sinister, Sullivan wouldn't wrap himself in one. If this was prelude to assault, he wouldn't waste time on demonstrations about fabric weight and warmth properties. Martinez, Thompson, and Chen began unpacking the bags, pulling out folded gray blankets and stacking them on a relatively clean section of concrete floor near the door. The blankets accumulated, 10, 20, 30, until there were enough for everyone with some excess. Martinez counted the women, counted the blankets, then added a few more to the stack. "Extras," Chen translated, "in case some want too, for the very cold nights." Sullivan gestured to the blankets. "Take 1, or 2, whatever you need. They are yours. We will leave now so you can distribute them among yourselves without us present." He started toward the door, followed by the other 3 soldiers. Before exiting, Sullivan paused, spoke again through Chen. "The door will remain locked until morning. This is standard security protocol for all housing facilities, not specific to you. But you are safe. No one will disturb you tonight. The blankets are for staying warm. That is all. Morning wake-up is at 06 Gameru." Then they left, closing the door behind them, lock clicking into place. 43 women sat in silence, staring at a pile of gray wool blankets stacked near the door. The blankets were real. Visibly, obviously, undeniably real. Properly folded, uniformly gray, standard military issue. But the transition from terror to normalcy was too abrupt to process immediately. No one moved for perhaps 2 minutes. Then Keiko Yamamoto, 35, former nurse from Kyoto, pragmatic and weary, stood and walked to the pile. She picked up one blanket, unfolded it, examined it carefully. She smelled it. Checking for chemical contamination, Michiko realized. She rubbed the fabric between her fingers, testing texture. She wrapped it around her shoulders experimentally, feeling its weight. "It's a blanket," Keiko said flatly. "Wool. Clean. Smells like storage and mothballs. Warm already just from holding it. I don't detect any contamination or treatment that would indicate biological or chemical weapon." Her medical training made the assessment credible. Either it's exactly what they said, blanket for warmth, or it's the most elaborate deception I've encountered. The validation broke the paralysis. Women rose, moved toward the pile, each taking a blanket with varying degrees of caution. Michiko took hers last, hands trembling slightly as she picked up a folded blanket from the remaining stack. The wool was rough under her fingers, scratchy in an authentic way that synthetic materials couldn't replicate. The blanket was heavy, maybe 4 pounds, with heft that came from actual material rather than just size. She unfolded it slowly, revealing the full blanket. 6 feet by 7 feet, large enough to wrap around her body completely or to use as ground cover with excess for covering. The color was uniform gray. The weave was tight and even. The edges were properly finished with stitched binding. She brought it to her face, breathing in the scent. Mothballs, wool, slight mustiness that suggested military storage but not contamination. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and startling. Not from trapped body heat yet. She didn't have excess heat to trap, but from insulation that blocked the cold radiating from concrete floor and walls. The difference between having no barrier and having this thick wool blanket was profound. Around the warehouse, similar reactions. Women wrapping themselves in gray wool, faces showing mixture of relief and residual suspicion, and something else. Grief, Michiko recognized. They were grieving the loss of certainty. For weeks, they'd been certain of their fate, violation and execution. That certainty had been terrible, but it had been clear. Now, holding warm blankets distributed without violence or demand for payment, they faced uncertainty that was somehow more destabilizing than the terrible certainty had been. Yuki sat beside Michiko, wrapped in her own blanket, face showing confusion that mirrored what Michiko felt. They gave us blankets. Yes, 4 American soldiers entered at night, and they gave us blankets. Yes, I was certain. I was absolutely certain. I know. So was I. The conversation died, because neither had framework for understanding what had just happened. Propaganda had prepared them for violation. Reality had delivered wool blankets. The gap between expectation and experience was too wide to bridge immediately. Michiko lay down on the concrete floor, blanket wrapped around her body like cocoon. The floor was still cold beneath her, but the blanket created barrier between her and the cold that made sleep conceivable rather than impossible. She pulled the edge over her face, creating cave of gray wool and darkness, and felt tears slide down her cheeks. Silent tears of confusion and relief, and the exhausting whiplash of terror answered with unexpected kindness. Around her, 42 women settled into sleep with varying degrees of success. Some wept quietly. Others lay rigid, unable to relax despite blankets. A few whispered to companions, trying to process what had, or more significantly, hadn't, happened. But all of them were warmer than they'd been in weeks of sleeping without adequate covering, and warmth made survival slightly more endurable, even when survival remained shameful. This wasn't sentiment. This was policy, though Michiko wouldn't understand the framework for days. The American approach to Japanese female prisoners was documented in directives that acknowledged both the propaganda that shaped prisoners' expectations and the obligation to provide conditions that contradicted those expectations through sustained decent treatment. The directives were specific. Female prisoners would be housed separately from males, supervised by female staff whenever possible, provided adequate bedding and covering, and protected from any form of sexual contact or assault. The policy rested on 4 considerations. First, legal compliance. Geneva Conventions required adequate shelter and protection, and violations would constitute war crimes. Second, intelligence value. Women treated protectively might provide information about civilian conditions and military operations on Lost Islands. Third, psychological warfare. Prisoners who received decent treatment contradicted Japanese propaganda, and word of that treatment might reduce resistance among civilians and soldiers still fighting. Fourth, moral imperative. Regardless of race-based wartime propaganda, most American commanders recognized prisoners as human beings deserving basic protection and dignity. The blankets were U.S. Army surplus, standard issue for troops in cold climates, warehoused in Guam after troops had been deployed elsewhere. Colonel Andrew Patterson, facility commander, had requisitioned them 3 weeks earlier after inspecting housing facilities and noting that concrete floors in converted warehouses provided no insulation against temperature drops that occurred nightly. His requisition memo stated, "Prisoners housed in facilities 7 to 12 require bedding beyond current provisions. Concrete floors retain cold. Nighttime temperatures drop to 65 degrees. Inadequate covering creates conditions conducive to respiratory illness. Request 300 wool blankets from supply." The request had been approved. Delivery had occurred that afternoon. Distribution had begun that evening. Over the following days, Michiko learned to live with her blanket in ways that transformed her experience of captivity. The blanket wasn't just nighttime covering. It became constant companion. She wore it draped around her shoulders during daytime hours, when warehouse temperature was cool, used it at night as full body covering, and on particularly cold evenings, followed Keiko's suggestion and took a second blanket from the extras to create layered insulation. The physical transformation was immediate. She slept more soundly than she had in months. Actual restorative sleep, rather than the fitful half-consciousness that had characterized previous weeks. The chronic cold that had made every muscle ache dissipated. The respiratory symptoms, persistent cough, runny nose, that had affected most of the women began clearing as they slept warm rather than cold. But the psychological transformation was more complex. The blanket challenged her framework for understanding American intentions in ways that required complete reconstruction of certainty. If Americans intended to use and then kill them, providing functional blankets contradicted that intention. If cruelty was standard, choosing to requisition blankets and distribute them at night, despite how that distribution might be interpreted, suggested concern about welfare rather than indifference. If propaganda was accurate, none of this made sense. Private Chen noticed the change during morning inspections. The women had color in their faces rather than the grayish pallor of chronic cold exposure. They moved with more energy rather than the sluggish conservation mode that had characterized previous weeks. They were sleeping. Chen could tell by the improved cognitive function and reduced irritability that came from actual rest. During one inspection, Chen spoke to Michiko directly. She'd been identified as informal leader by virtue of being oldest and most educated. His Japanese was careful but comprehensible. Blankets working? You are warm enough? Warmer. Yes. Michiko answered cautiously, uncertain what response was expected. Good. Colonel Patterson was concerned. He said prisoners shouldn't be cold when blankets exist and can be provided. He said. Chen paused, searching for vocabulary. He said suffering from cold is unnecessary when solution is available. So he got blankets. The explanation was notable for what it revealed about command priorities. Patterson had identified problem, cold prisoners, and had taken action to solve it not because he particularly liked Japanese prisoners, but because allowing preventable suffering violated his understanding of proper prisoner management. The distinction between acting from affection versus acting from standards was significant. In the second week after blankets arrived, Dr. Catherine Morrison conducted medical examinations of all female prisoners. Morrison was 46, Army Medical Corps, had treated wounded soldiers and civilians throughout Pacific Campaign. She examined Michiko with professional thoroughness, checking for malnutrition symptoms, respiratory problems, skin conditions. Your color is better than initial intake photos, Morrison noted through interpreter. You're sleeping adequately? Yes. The blankets help. Good. That's their purpose. Morrison made notes on medical chart. Cold sleep deprivation weakens immune system, makes illness more likely. Warm sleep supports recovery. Simple intervention. Significant impact. The clinical framing, blankets as medical intervention rather than kindness, was somehow more credible than expressions of concern would have been. Morrison saw blankets as practical solution to environmental problem, implemented because alternatives were worse for prisoner health and administrative efficiency. By the third week, Michiko had developed relationship with her blanket that went beyond functional use. She'd learned which corner had slightly softer weave, which edge was best for wrapping around shoulders versus feet, how to fold it for maximum warmth versus maximum coverage. The blanket had become personal possession in a way that surprised her. Technically military property on loan, but it felt like hers through intimate daily contact. She also noticed how blankets affected social dynamics. Women who'd been isolated by cold and fear, minimizing interaction, conserving energy, became more communicative as warmth restored capacity for social engagement. Evening conversations developed in the warehouse. Women wrapped in gray blankets gathering to share memories of home, teach each other English words, speculate about repatriation timing. Yuki, who'd been most certain about impending assault that first night, became vocal advocate for reconsidering assumptions. During one evening gathering, she said, "I was wrong about what would happen when soldiers brought blankets. I was wrong because propaganda taught me to interpret every American action as prelude to cruelty. But 3 weeks have passed. No one has touched us. No one has even suggested touching us. The blankets are just blankets. Tools for staying warm, nothing more. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. In the 4th week, an incident tested the boundaries of improved conditions. A male guard, Private Daniel Wilson, 22, newly arrived at the facility, was discovered trying to enter the female housing warehouse at 23 UOD. He'd claimed he was conducting security check, ensuring prisoners were present and accounted for. The female guard on duty, Corporal Sarah Martinez, 30, Women's Army Corps, had refused him entry and reported him immediately to her commanding officer. Michiko didn't witness the disciplinary proceedings, but she heard the results through camp communication networks. Wilson had been court-martialed, found guilty of violating standing orders prohibiting male guards from entering female housing areas without female supervision, demoted to private with loss of pay, transferred to different facility, and given formal reprimand that would remain on permanent record. The punishment was severe for someone who claimed merely to be conducting security check. Chen explained during the next inspection, Colonel Patterson doesn't tolerate violations of protection protocols. Female housing areas are off-limits to male guards except in emergencies with female supervision present. Wilson knew this. All guards are briefed explicitly. He violated orders. Consequences are serious because protection of female prisoners is serious. The word protection was significant. Not management or custody, protection. As though vulnerability was acknowledged and being addressed rather than being exploited or ignored. The enforcement demonstrated that protection wasn't just policy on paper, but standard that was maintained through accountability. By the 5th week, mail service had been established. Michiko received notification that she could write letters to family in Japan, subject to censorship, to be delivered through Red Cross channels once postal services in Japan were re-established. She was given paper, pencil, envelope. She sat with these materials for an hour before writing, uncertain what to say. How could she explain that she was alive when dying had been expected? How could she describe conditions that contradicted everything her family would have been told about American prisoner camps? How could she convey that the Americans had given her blankets, gray wool blankets, warm and functional, when the concept of Americans providing anything except suffering seemed impossible? She wrote carefully, I am alive. I am held by American forces on Guam. I am provided adequate food and shelter. I have warm blanket for sleeping. I am treated fairly under circumstances. I do not know when I will be released or what awaits in Japan. I think of you daily. Please respond if you receive this. Michiko. She didn't mention the suicide attempt. She didn't describe the certainty of violation that first night, or the profound confusion when blankets arrived instead. She didn't detail her ongoing struggle to reconcile propaganda's promises with reality's contradictions. Those truths felt too raw, too likely to be misunderstood, or to worry family who couldn't help from distance. In the 6th week, Keiko developed pneumonia. The respiratory infection progressed rapidly despite the blanket's warmth. She'd apparently been fighting bronchitis for weeks before blankets arrived, and the infection had progressed too far for warmth alone to resolve. Dr. Morrison admitted her to the facility infirmary, treated her with antibiotics and oxygen therapy, monitored her continuously until the crisis passed. Morrison explained to Michiko during a check-in visit, Keiko will recover. The pneumonia was serious, but we caught it in time. Before blankets, she might have developed this infection earlier, when her body was more compromised by chronic cold. The blankets probably delayed onset and maintained her strength enough that treatment could be effective. The calculation was pragmatic. Blankets as preventive medicine, worth their logistical cost in reduced medical complications and prevented deaths. But the underlying premise was notable. Preventing prisoner deaths was goal worth investing resources to achieve. By the 7th week, Michiko had begun tentative consideration of the future. Repatriation was being discussed. Prisoners would be returned to Japan in groups once occupation authorities established adequate reception facilities. But the prospect of returning filled her with complicated dread. She'd failed to die honorably. She'd survived American captivity that was supposed to be worse than death. She'd received blankets and adequate food and medical care. How could she explain this to family, to community that had been taught that survival of capture meant collaboration, or worse? Private Chen, whose language skills made him regular presence during inspections, noticed her distress during one morning count. After official inspection was complete, he approached her. "You seem troubled. Are conditions here problematic?" Michiko struggled with how to articulate the problem. "Conditions here are adequate, better than expected. That is the problem." Chen looked confused. She tried to explain. "Japanese propaganda taught us that American captivity would be worse than death. We were told to die rather than be captured. I survived capture. I have been treated adequately, given food, shelter, blankets, medical care. When I returned to Japan, how do I explain that propaganda was wrong? That Americans were not cruel? That I am alive because your doctor saved me when I tried to die as honor required?" Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, "You survived. That's not shameful. That's fortunate. You can tell truth about treatment here. Some will believe you. Those who don't, that's their burden, not yours. You're not responsible for propaganda's lies. You're only responsible for your own truth." The perspective was startling in its simplicity. She didn't have to defend propaganda or reconcile its contradictions. She could simply tell truth. She survived. She was treated adequately. The blankets were warm, and reality was more complicated than any nation's propaganda allowed. In the 8th week, Colonel Patterson made an announcement through interpreters. Prisoners would be repatriated beginning in October, in groups organized by home prefecture to facilitate reunification with families. Medical examinations would ensure everyone was healthy for transport. Small financial stipend would be provided for immediate needs upon arrival, and blankets would travel with prisoners. Prisoners could keep the blankets they'd been issued for use during journey and initial weeks home. The announcement created immediate reaction. Keep the blankets? Take them to Japan? The gesture was unexpected and significant. Military equipment was rarely given to repatriated prisoners, usually confiscated or reclaimed for reuse. Allowing prisoners to keep blankets suggested they were seen as individuals with ongoing needs, rather than temporary problems to be processed and forgotten. Yuki voiced what many were thinking. "They're letting us keep military property. Why? Blankets could be reused for new prisoners or returned to supply." Michiko had been contemplating this. "Because we need them more than Army needs them back. Because journey to Japan will be cold, ships crossing Pacific in autumn, trains through devastated cities. Because Colonel Patterson thinks preventing us from being cold during repatriation matters, even though we'll no longer be his responsibility. The last reason, concern for welfare beyond direct administrative responsibility, required accepting that American command structure operated with ethical framework that extended beyond minimum legal compliance." In the 9th week, Michiko decided she would tell the truth when she returned. She would tell her family that she'd attempted suicide as honor required, that Americans had saved her life, that she'd been treated adequately in captivity. She would tell them about the blankets, how 4 soldiers had entered at night and she'd been certain of violation, how they'd distributed wool blankets instead, how that moment had shattered everything propaganda had taught about American cruelty. Some wouldn't believe her. Some would accuse her of collaboration or Stockholm Syndrome or being too traumatized to see reality clearly. But others might believe, might understand that propaganda had been lies designed to maintain hatred, might begin the difficult work of rebuilding understanding based on evidence rather than nationalist doctrine. On her last evening at the Guam facility, November 2nd, 1945, Dr. Morrison found Michiko in the warehouse. She handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Medical supplies for journey, basic first aid, bandages, antiseptic, pain medication. Also, she unwrapped a corner to show contents. Extra blanket, new one from supply, for your mother or sister or whoever needs it when you reach home. Michiko accepted the package, holding it carefully. 2 blankets, the worn one she'd used for 2 months, and this new one still crisp from storage. Thank you. For everything. for treating us as human beings despite propaganda that taught us you would treat us as disposable. Morrison looked uncomfortable with gratitude. We did minimum required by convention and basic decency. That shouldn't be remarkable, but I understand why it is given what you were told to expect. The journey home took 19 days, shipped to Yokohama, processing through occupation authorities, train to Osaka. Michiko carried her small bag with few possessions. Letters from family, the clothes she'd received at Guam, the medical supplies from Morrison, and 2 gray wool blankets wrapped carefully to prevent damage. Osaka was worse than she'd imagined. Entire districts burned to ash, infrastructure destroyed, people living in improvised shelters that offered no protection from autumn cold. Her family's neighborhood was partially rebuilt, temporary housing replacing homes that had burned. But construction was incomplete and inadequate for approaching winter. Her mother lived in 2 rooms with Michiko's younger sister, heated by small charcoal brazier that warmed perhaps 6-foot radius. The rooms were bitterly cold everywhere else. Her mother looked ancient, aged decades by war and privation, and the grief of believing her eldest daughter had died on Saipan. But she wept when Michiko appeared at the door, holding her daughter with strength that seemed impossible from such frail arms. "You're alive. You survived." "How?" "I survived because American soldiers gave me warm blankets when I was cold." Michiko unwrapped the 2 gray wool blankets, spreading them on the floor. "These are for us. American Army issue. To keep us warm this winter." Her sister touched one of the blankets, feeling thick wool. "They let you keep military blankets?" "Yes. Colonel Patterson said we would need them for journey home and after." He was correct. Osaka is colder than Guam, and these blankets will help us survive winter. Her mother wrapped herself in one of the blankets, pulling it tight around shivering body. Tears streamed down her face. "Then they were not the demons we were told about. They kept you alive. They sent you home with tools to keep us alive. That is more than our own government managed." Decades later, in a modest apartment in modern Osaka, Michiko Tanaka, widowed after her husband's early death, mother of 3, worked as administrator until retirement, kept a wool blanket folded on a shelf in her closet. Not the original blankets from Guam, which had worn through after decades of use, but an identical blanket, U.S. Army surplus, purchased from specialty shop, kept as memorial and reminder. Her granddaughter, 15 and studying World War II in school, asked about it one winter evening. "Oba-chan, why do you keep that scratchy old blanket? It looks so uncomfortable." Michiko was preparing dinner, habit from decades of caring for family she'd maintained into her 80s. She set down her knife and retrieved the blanket, unfolding it carefully. The wool was gray, thick, exactly like the blankets that had changed her understanding of enemies and protection. "This is American Army blanket, like the one I received when I was prisoner on Guam. I thought American soldiers would use us and kill us. That's what propaganda taught. Instead, they gave us blankets, warm blankets, clean blankets, blankets that meant survival rather than death." The girl looked skeptical. "But Oba-chan, weren't you scared?" "Terrified. When 4 soldiers entered at night carrying bags, I was certain my time had come. I was certain propaganda had been right, and they would violate us as we'd been warned. Instead, they distributed blankets and left. They locked the door to keep other soldiers out, not to trap us. They provided warmth because cold was unnecessary suffering when solution existed." "Why do you keep the blanket now?" Michiko returned the blanket to its shelf, folded precisely. "Because it reminds me that propaganda is always less powerful than sustained decent treatment. That enemies can choose not to be cruel even when cruelty would be easy and expected. That sometimes the gap between expectation and reality is measured in wool, in blankets given when violation was anticipated, in warmth provided when cold would have been simpler. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember, and why." The blanket remained on the shelf. Gray wool testament to the night terror was answered with unexpected kindness. Michiko cooked dinner, maintaining the rituals that had sustained her through 8 decades of life built from ruins. The blanket reminded her that survival began the moment American medics refused to let her die. Continued through the night, blankets arrived instead of assault. persisted through the choice to tell truth about adequate treatment, despite knowing some wouldn't believe. The measure of civilization isn't found in its weapons or its propaganda. It's found in blankets distributed to prisoners who expected violation, in locked doors that kept threats out rather than victims in medical care that saved lives of those who'd tried to die because propaganda taught death was preferable to capture. And the measure of healing is found in keeping blanket for 80 years, in looking at gray wool and remembering the moment expectation shattered against reality, in understanding that propaganda makes you certain but evidence makes you wise, in choosing to tell truth even when truth contradicts everything a nation taught its citizens to believe. The war had taught millions that Americans were demons who would violate and kill Japanese prisoners, that capture meant fates worse than death, that dying was only honorable choice. But in a warehouse on Guam, a different lesson was taught through gray wool blankets. Some people choose warmth over cruelty, protection over exploitation, decency over the ease of confirming propaganda's worst predictions. Sometimes civilization is measured in blankets. In wool distributed at night, when distribution could be so easily misinterpreted. In warmth provided when cold would solve administrative problems through attrition. In permission to keep military property, because prisoners would need warmth beyond captivity. In the choice to cover vulnerable people with blankets when covering them with shame would be simpler. The blanket testified to this truth. Wool preserved through decades. Reminder that the hardest journey is from absolute certainty to confused understanding, to acceptance that reality is more complicated than any propaganda allows. That 4 soldiers carrying bags in darkness can bring warmth instead of violence. That being wrong about enemies' intentions is sometimes the most important thing to learn. That survival isn't shameful when survival was supposed to be impossible and decent treatment was supposed to be myth. The measure of a nation is found in how it treats those it has every ideological reason to dehumanize, every practical motivation to exploit, every propaganda-driven justification to destroy. It's found in blankets distributed despite knowing that distribution would be interpreted as prelude to assault. It's found in locked doors that protect rather than imprison. It's found in commanders who requisition blankets because unnecessary suffering offends their understanding of proper conduct. It's found in soldiers who carry heavy bags at night, knowing their approach will terrify but doing it anyway, because warmth matters, and fear is temporary, but cold kills slowly. The blanket sat on the closet shelf, gray wool and worn edges, testament to the truth that sometimes the most profound moments are the simplest. Soldiers brought blankets, women were warm, expectations were shattered, and decades later, an elderly woman keeps wool on a shelf to remember that propaganda promised demons, but reality delivered decent men who chose to cover vulnerable prisoners with warmth instead of shame, with blankets instead of violence, with evidence that humanity persists even across lines of war and propaganda and racial hatred that tried to make kindness impossible.